Hi, I'm Dr. Kevin Yuill and I lecture in American history, and I'm going to talk to you today about the relationship of African Americans and guns. And the title for my paper is Better Die Fighting Than to Die Like a Dog, African Americans and Guns, 1867 to 1968. So I'm going to take you through all the various different phases. First of all, let me introduce you to Mary Turner. That's her in the slide. She was the postmistress for Montana. She was 6 foot tall and killed wolves and punched men. She was a real sort of character, and I just like that picture that shows her not taking any sort of nonsense from anybody, and how African Americans really used weapons to defend themselves. And the opposite of that is that the whole history of African American and guns is the elite taking away weapons that could be used to defend themselves from African Americans and from other minority groups. So let's first start with a little bit of a story from 1892 from Memphis. And what had happened is that a fist fight had got out of control, and there were tensions between blacks and whites in the town of Memphis. There had never been a lynching there, but the tensions were there nevertheless. An African American shop had opened up that was a rival to the local white shop, and there had been problems whereby the African Americans felt threatened enough that they posted an armed guard. They were within their legal rights to do so. On a Saturday night, when men were gathering around the grocery shop, they heard some noise at the back, and 3 armed white men came and through the back door and were shot and wounded by the African Americans who were manning the guard of the shop. The 3 shop owners were taken out and placed in prison, and a near riot occurred. It seemed to have calmed down when the Tennessee Rifles, who were a black militia, who were posted to protect the African Americans in prison against the possibility of lynching, the Tennessee Rifles decided to stand down their guard because the tension seemed to have gone. However, the night that the Tennessee Guards stood down their guard, several white men broke in to the prison on the pretext to bring in a prisoner, and seized Calvin and 2 others. They took them out and they put them on one of the push carts on the railway and killed them in cold blood. So in response to these lynchings, we have a new hero really rising up, Ida B. Wells, who lived from 1862 to 1931 and became an anti-lynching activist. This was her first experience of lynching. It had frightened her quite a bit. Ida Wells is quite useful to quote on this whole story, as she attacked the city of Memphis for taking away the arms from African Americans. And this is what happened. The Tennessee Rifles they had their arms removed the next day by a judge's order. And as she complained, the city of Memphis has demonstrated that neither character nor standing avails the Negro if he dares to protect himself against the white man or become his rival. There's nothing that we can do about the lynching now, as we are outnumbered and without arms. The white mob could help itself to ammunition without pay, but the order was rigidly enforced against selling of guns to Negroes. And leading citizens of the town had destroyed Ida Wells' paper shortly after when she had published this. And as she recalled at the time, I bought a pistol for the first thing after Tim Moss was lynched, because I expected some cowardly retaliation from the lynchers. I felt that one had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap. I had already determined to sell my life as dearly as possible if attacked. I felt that if I could take just one lyncher with me, this would even up the score a little bit. And what I'm trying to illustrate with this story is that there's a totally different attitude towards African Americans and guns that happened in this pre-Second World War period than did afterwards. Nowadays, we tend to think of African Americans as being the victims of white violence, and we don't think of them as being people who stood up to white violence and protected themselves against white violence. And I think that's where things have changed quite a bit. And what I wanted to sort of illustrate to you is in actual fact that African Americans have normally possessed weapons, and that weapons are a very good idea for a downtrodden group of people to protect themselves against bullying and attacks from the more powerful racial group. And that this is how really they were used. So Ida B. Wells, fascinating character. She was an anti-lynching activist, traveled to the United Kingdom to emphasize the evils of lynching, and became quite famous, although she's one of the more forgotten civil rights characters of that period of time. Now, in order to understand the relationship of African Americans and guns, we have to go right back to when the first African Americans emerged and when whites first came. And there is an interesting relationship between Americans and guns that you first have to understand. And this citation by James Berg illustrates it quite well. He says, "No kingdom can be secured otherwise than by arming a people. The possession of arms is the distinction between a free man and a slave. He who has nothing and who himself belongs to another must be defended by him whose property he is, and he needs no arms. But he who thinks he is his own master and has what he can call his own ought to have arms to defend himself and what he possesses, else he lives precariously and at discretion." And as you can see from this, from the Roman numerals, this is written in 1774. So we're talking about several very distinct eras. I think, first of all, I'm talking really about the era after the Civil War, after slavery was got rid of. From Reconstruction, which takes place from 1867 to 1877, the Gilded Age, what we might call the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1895, Progressive Era and the New Deal, 1895 to 1941, and post-war liberalism, 1945 to 1968. These are all very approximate dates. I have to warn you, there's no agreement between historians as to which dates are appropriate, except for perhaps Reconstruction. So prior to the Civil War, African Americans were allowed guns at times, but often were not allowed guns. And there was a 1648 act preventing Negroes from bearing arms directed at slaves and passed in the Virginia legislature. This is one of the earliest gun control acts. Massachusetts, indicating the changing needs of the colonists up in the north, enacted a statute in 1652 which was specifying that militia enlistments were to include all Scotsmen, Negroes, Sikh, and Indians inhabiting with or servants to the English. So it was anybody that could be enlisted, particularly in the early battles against the Native Americans. Then African Americans would be given guns, but at other times they were taken off of them. One of the most fascinating cases is Dred Scott versus Sanford, which came about in 1857. And this was very important in deciding the status of African Americans, and it's very telling in relation to the possession of weapons. Justice Roger B. Taney, who's delivered the opinion for the court, noted that, quote, "For if they were so received and entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens, it would give them the full liberty of speech in public and in private upon all subjects upon which its own citizens might speak, to hold public meetings upon political affairs, and to keep and carry arms wherever they went. And all of this would be done in the face of the subject race of the same color, both free and slaves, and inevitably producing discontent and insubordination among them and endangering the peace and safety of the state." And I think that's a very interesting and telling judgment, because it basically illustrates that anybody who was not allowed a weapon was essentially a slave, and it also makes very clear the connection between citizenship and owning of weapons. In the Reconstruction Era, 1867 to 1877, this is the period when African Americans were brutally suppressed by both paramilitary organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and unofficial agencies. This was done unofficially simply because it had to be done behind the backs of the troops, the northern troops who were actually dominating. This was a period of time, or who were occupying the South, more accurately. This was a period of time when African Americans became powerful for the first times in their lives. They rushed to schools, they rushed to get married, and they rushed to possess weapons. All of these things had been denied them in the past. They made up most of the militias, but they were extraordinarily underarmed in terms of the weapons that they possessed, and they were also, many of them, illiterate, and it was a very difficult group of people to mold into a militia. They needed experienced whites, but the Southern whites absolutely refused to go into militias with their former slaves. You also had African American representation at Congress. You had African representation in the legislatures. So this was a period of time where African Americans took power, but it was also a period of time when we had the Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary groups simply taking weapons away from African Americans, and just as importantly, by dissuading them, shall we say, from taking to the polls and expressing their opinion in a democratic way. It was about taking power away from African Americans. So we have the Hamburg Massacre, which occurred in Hamburg, South Carolina, just over the border from Georgia. And this was a town that was African American and had a very well-armed militia with the latest Springfield rifles. An incident was engineered by some local whites, whereby they quarreled with the militia and told them to get out of the way. The militia said, "We are drilling right now and you can go around us." And the whites refused. A huge white troop that outnumbered the black militia came and decided to disarm the militia. It was led by a judge, and it was also led by ex-Confederate soldiers. They went and attacked the African Americans with cannon and with 150 men. And there was a massacre whereby 13 of the African Americans were shot dead, most of them after they had surrendered. This was condemned by Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly tended to be one of the pro-African American papers that existed at the time. So you can see there the illustration of the Hamburg Massacre. The attacks at this particular time tended to be horrific. If you ever think that violence occurred in the US West, as with the law, actually a lot more violence took place in the US South, and it was generally to disarm blacks. That was its purpose. So we also have the Colfax Massacre. The Colfax Massacre occurred in 1873 during the same period of time when you had rival militias fighting over a particular election in Colfax, Louisiana. And as you can see from the slide, there's Harper's Weekly talking about removing the wounded and burying the dead. And as the sign says at the Colfax riot, interesting sign, it was erected in the 1950s during the period of segregation and Jim Crow. And so therefore it was a riot. It wasn't a massacre as it is now referred to, and which is much more properly referred to. And in Colfax in 1873, after this disputed election, you had black and white militias fighting it out around the court building. The black militia retreated to the court building, being less well armed than the white militia, and they set fire to the court building, and 150 black Americans, actually they think it's probably around 83 now, but according to this sign it says 150 blacks and 3 white men were slain. And this was one of the most bloody massacres that occurred, but this is what characterized this period of time. It was to take power away from African Americans, and disarming them was a very important part of that. If we go up to the sort of Gilded Age, before Plessy versus Ferguson, we have a period whereby the first gun controls are brought in. And these gun controls can be brought in because Southerners, after 1877, after what we call in history the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, whereby Union troops were withdrawn from the South in order that Rutherford B. Hayes became president, and the Republicans removed these troops, that allowed Southerners back into their own legislatures, and they managed to disempower African Americans very effectively. And this is the period of time when you actually have gun controls coming in. And gun controls are created at the state level, and what they have the effect of doing is disarming African Americans and nobody else. So for instance, in Georgia, you banned cheap weapons. Now what they knew was that ex-Confederate weapons, those who had kept their pistols, who are Confederate soldiers, could keep them, but African Americans could not keep, they could not purchase weapons and could not arm themselves. So this was a period of when ostensibly color-neutral gun controls were implemented, but they had the effect of taking guns away from African Americans and leaving well-armed whites in the South with all of their weapons. If we go up to 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, and the advent of Jim Crow, you will probably be familiar. If you're not, it was in 1892, 30-year-old Homer Plessy, who was what was called an octoroon, that is, he was 1/8 black, and as you can see from the picture, doesn't particularly look black, and had to instruct people that he was black in order to be refused. Nobody would have refused him other than that. But he protested, and he sat in a white car of the Eastern Louisiana Railroad in order to provoke an arrest, and his case went right to the Supreme Court in 1896. His lawyer argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, those ones that were enacted right after the Civil War in order to guarantee equality to African Americans. And during that period of time, Plessy versus Ferguson went straight to the Supreme Court, and it's a very familiar period whereby in 1896 it was declared that separate but equal facilities for African Americans were permissible. And this changed the whole dynamic of the Gilded Age period, if you like, whereby whites felt much more confident about restricting the rights of African Americans and felt much more justified about doing that. We now have a period whereby they are much more racial in arguing for why African Americans should not have rights, and the separate but equal allows some extra laws to come in there. At this particular time as well, there are wars and rumors of wars that you can find evidence for looking at this particular period of time. A race war is feared, as it shows up here. Whites and Negroes in serious conflict. And there's this great fear of African Americans rebelling. It's what we call the fin de siècle period, whereby whites are fearing that they are going to be engulfed by people of color, and that this was a real serious problem. It's when whites looked at issues like race suicide and felt that whites weren't breeding fast enough and that blacks were breeding too fast. So you have this underlying fear that African Americans are going to take over, and you have a much more confident whites in order to take the arms of African Americans. Interestingly, in the 1890s you have riots, so-called, which are in reality massacres, mostly because in the 1890s the build-up of fear had not got to the point whereby people felt they had to really address the problem of violence towards African Americans because it might provoke African Americans. And this is what happens in the early 1900s, particularly with the 1906 Atlanta riot, whereby suddenly they're panicking that African Americans could arm themselves and could create a lot of problems for white Americans. And you can see from this particular slide that the course adopted by the military when they had the riots in Atlanta, shortly after the riots, the military went and disarmed the entire Negro population as best it possibly could. They went around with a Gatling gun, the machine gun of the time, and a very heavily armed military went out and searched every black home, and as it says here, looking for deadly weapons, and disarmed the African Americans. The African Americans had been victims of this riot, but they were so paranoid about the potential of African Americans to attack back or to defend themselves effectively that they decided to disarm the African Americans. It's blatant that they are actually doing so, and as you can see from this particular headline, "Disarm the Negroes," this was much more blatant than in the previous period of time when there had been not the confidence to do so. What was the black response to this? Because what did African Americans make of this entire period? As Bishop Henry McNeill Turner said, "Get guns, Negroes," he wrote in the Milwaukee Journal in 1897 in response to several cowardly lynchings. And he said, "Let every Negro in the country who has a spark of manhood in him supply his house with 1, 2, or 3 guns, and keep them loaded and ready for immediate use, whereby he can let, as he said, turn loose your missiles of death and blow the fiendish invaders into 1,000 giblets." Other people did so, but not in perhaps such colorful words as Bishop McNeill Turner. Supporters of an armed African American population, including W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and probably the most celebrated black intellectual that we have had. Also, though, Mary White Ovington, social worker and founder of the National Association of Colored People as well, she was in favor of a well-armed African American population because both of them were very aware that African Americans were subject to attacks so long as they didn't defend themselves. And so they were anxious for African Americans to be able to defend themselves in the event of white attacks. So when we're looking at this particular period of time, we're rushing up to this period where there are riots, but there are, particularly in relation to the 1919 Chicago riot, there is a real sense that we need to calm this down, we need to disarm everybody, and this is one of the demands that is made by the Commission on Race Relations. There's a real emphasis on race relations rather than through any concern for equality. They wanted to disarm everybody in this particular situation, and suddenly they were as concerned about whites being overly possessed of weapons as they were African Americans. And it's really, this culminates in the 1934 National Firearms Act and 1938 Federal Firearms Act. These are the first real gun controls done on a federal level. And these ones regulated sawed-off shotguns, machine guns, and they cracked down on interstate crime. This gangsterism was a particular problem, Al Capone, etc., etc. And it occurred in the context of a peace and disarmament societies as well, particularly after the First World War, became a very popular cry. And in the South, these restrictions were, of course, inevitably used against African Americans who were carrying less sophisticated weapons. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, African Americans were again subject to these ostensibly race-neutral restrictions that seem to be talked about only in terms of African Americans rather than whites. So then we come to the post-war period of time. First of all, the post-war period of time is thought of as a period of readiness, particularly in the context of the Cold War. Everybody was supposed to be armed in order to defend against a foe and to attack anybody that was invading the United States. It was a period of massive gun ownership and a popular gun ownership, the cheapening of weapons, and it's one of the most peaceful periods of American history as well, up until the late 1960s, where people were extraordinarily well armed. But yet it was very, very peaceful. During this period of time, of course, African Americans embarked on civil rights movements, but one of the codicils of the civil rights movement was nonviolence, very much looking after Gandhi, inspired by Gandhi and his ostensible success in India in freeing Indians from British rule. Martin Luther King and others were inspired by this nonviolence and had a whole perspective that they should be nonviolent and they should have their movements characterized by nonviolence. But that's not to say that at the same time they weren't heavily armed. Particularly Martin Luther King had an entire bastion of arms that he kept, and it was very necessary. There were attacks on all civil rights leaders during this period of time, and in fact, de facto, they had a very heavily armed presence, normally at Martin Luther King's house, where he would post 1 or 2 armed guards and have a complete armory of weapons that he let white reporters see. It wasn't a great secret, and it was very necessary for immediate protection. So during this period of time, this whole emphasis on nonviolence doesn't take account of the fact that African Americans were extraordinarily well armed. We can also look at the contrasting views of Robert F. Williams, who did not espouse the nonviolence that Martin Luther King and other African American leaders, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and these other various organizations, the sort of nonviolence that they espoused were not espoused by everybody. And Robert F. Williams wrote Negroes with Guns about his experiences in a southern town. He was an African American ex-soldier who came back determined not to take the kind of rubbish that African Americans had taken before the war, and who kept several weapons at any given time. And as he points out, when the Ku Klux Klan confronted him, 5 African Americans with guns confronted them back, and suddenly the Ku Klux Klan faded. They were unwilling, as he made the point, to trade shots because they felt that African Americans' lives were not as valuable as theirs. So they weren't going to trade shots with people who they didn't have any respect for their lives because their lives were cheaper than the whites. And so therefore it's a very good idea in that you can defend yourself against people, the elite, and the elite will not be willing to bully you in the same way if they feel that you will fight back. And in his efforts to desegregate a swimming pool, he did very, very well and defended himself It's a fascinating book, well worth reading if you ever get the chance, just for the amusing stories as much as anything. He talks about a situation whereby he's surrounded by a white mob, and where he gets out of the car and armed with a rifle and a pistol. And a southern white man of about 80 starts crying and says, "The Negroes have guns, the Negroes have guns." It's a fascinating story. So well worth reading. However, he was completely sidelined for defending himself. He was accused of kidnapping, and as you can see from the wanted poster there, he became a wanted man, could not flee any place. He tried to flee to Canada at first and ended up in Cuba and becoming a communist with the Cubans, and the sort of book reflects his experiences. But he was absolutely forced out for being armed, and he was not treated in the same way that other African American civil rights leaders were. The problem came when the nonviolence creed was threatened by the inability to secure African American equality in the North. When the great expectations of African Americans were not realized, people started not having faith in nonviolence anymore. And in fact, as you can see from this article on Martin Luther King, showdown for nonviolence. Suddenly in 1965, the Black Power idea came up and inspired people to defend themselves, and inspired people to leave the inclusive and nonviolent direction that Martin Luther King had espoused. And suddenly people fell off from this. And you can see that, for instance, Malcolm X became popular at around this time. Malcolm X, interestingly, is not popular at the particular time, or even up until the time he died. He's almost like a bad example that whites will use to say, if you don't like Martin Luther King, this is the kind of thing we get. And in fact, he made many outrageous statements. He was a sort of rent-a-phrase for many of the white papers. So he rose to prominence in a documentary called The Hate That Hate Produced, talking about the hatred of African Americans for whites, and that if you don't go with the moderate African Americans, this is the kind of thing we can get. But of course, this poster adorned every single student's wall for a period of about 15 years. Malcolm X, as we know, was assassinated by the Nation of Islam at that particular time, not by whites at all. And in fact, in that particular poster, he's worried about the Nation of Islam, not anybody else attacking him. However, he's this poster boy for black defensiveness, and for blacks able to defend themselves and armed if necessary. Finally, we have the culmination of the story in the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and in the 1968 Gun Control Act. At this particular time, the Black Panther Party, and this is the thing that people seem to forget about today, is that its very first act, of course, the Black Panther Party, was to march on the California legislature, scaring Governor Ronald Reagan, who left a party of school children to whoever had invaded. He ran, hightailed it, and he was talking to school children at the time. And the Black Panther Party assembled on the steps to attack the gun control legislation. That was its very first act in California, and its most notorious act. And of course, there's that picture of them having gone up with their Black Panther Party outfits and gone heavily armed into the legislature to attack a bill that was to say that nobody should have a loaded gun in public. And they actually protested against that. One of their theses was that if we outlaw guns, only pigs will have guns. That was their phrase. So everybody get a gun now before it's only pigs that have guns. They had their violent imagery, but they were opposed to taking weapons off of African Americans. They felt that's who it was directed against, and that African Americans needed guns for their own self-defense and to realize their rights. And it's very interesting to contrast the attitude today of the left, which is entirely to remove all weapons from anybody's hands, and the attitude of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Unfortunately, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was outgunned rather by the FBI, and 25 of them were shot dead in a period of 5 years. Some specifically just murdered, For instance, one very promising 18-year-old was shot in his bed after his girlfriend had been told to move out of the bed, and after his guard, who was sleeping at the time, had been shot dead with one rifle shot first thing in the morning. They lived by the sword and they died by the sword. But the 1968 Gun Control Act really reflected white fear of the black hand on the trigger. That's what it was really all about. And for instance, banning the Saturday Night Special as the 1968 Gun Control Act, some people who are in favor of it, as one journalist put it, that's specifically an anti-Negro statute because it takes away the guns that African Americans favor for their own self-protection. Cheap guns, again, that's something that's very much directed against African Americans rather than anybody else. Finally, after 1968, you had a period whereby the sides completely changed. The National Rifle Association had not favored, in fact it favored mild gun controls before 1968. It supported many of the measures that were involved in the 1968 Act. But in the 1970s you had an almost polar opposite, whereby the left espoused gun controls for the very first time, really, and the right became entirely anti-gun control. So you had the opposite of what had occurred in the past, where the right had conservatives were very in favor of gun controls, including, for instance, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was secretly in favor of gun controls, even though he did not want to publicly come out and say that he was, specifically because he was a conservative, because he wanted to take guns away from people who might harm the interests of the elite or prevent the elite from moving as freely as they might have. So you had a situation whereby in the 1970s the National Rifle Association suddenly became libertarian in favor of no gun controls, and the left had espoused gun controls that they thought would help people. So you can see that at the end of this period of time, for the vast majority of time, gun controls were directed at taking black fingers from the triggers of weapons, and that they were taken away, these weapons were taken away from African Americans at the same time as voting rights were taken away from African Americans, at the same time as, for instance, they were forced into their own neighborhoods, as the Jim Crow laws enforced colored and white water fountains. This was the period of time when gun controls were directed specifically at African Americans. They couldn't be done so as blatantly because the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States guarantees the right to bear arms for all citizens, and you couldn't say that, for instance, African Americans were not citizens and therefore were not allowed arms. So it's the sort of neutrality of these gun controls that was directed at African Americans that's noteworthy. And in the end, what the situation is today is entirely opposite, as I say. Now African American groups tend to be in favor of gun controls. But as the Black Panther Party shows, it wasn't always so.